The American tanks were driving hard. Schwarzkopf wanted them to drive harder. He had assumed the Republican Guard would move south to defend Kuwait, but they hadn't, and the Americans were struggling to make up the distance. Schwarzkopf wanted a headlong charge. The commander on the ground was more cautious.
You get a probability of increased casualties. You get the probability of an attack that starts and stops and starts and stops, loses momentum. I wanted to hit the Republican Guards with a 3-division fist. I didn't want to poke at them with fingers, in other words, piecemeal commitment of my forces. I want to hit them with a fist at full speed,
General Schwarzkopf indicated, Freddie, let's get this mission accomplished and let's do it ASAP.
On the third afternoon of the war, battle was finally joined with the Republican Guard. An armored cavalry troop of 9 tanks and 12 infantry carriers was leading the American advance. Ahead, behind a slight rise in the desert, Republican Guard tanks waited in ambush. The first tank approached.
As we crested the rise, my gunner identified tanks to our direct front, and he said, "Identified tanks." I yelled, "Fire." As I was yelling fire on the intercom, the gun erupted. The round impacted on the frontal slope of the tank, and the tank commander was ejected out of the hatch, and he himself was in flames. As the other tanks crested the rise, they began to select their targets and engaged in an almost simultaneous manner. So 15 seconds before, there was a cohesive or coherent Iraqi defense. 15 seconds later, that defense was completely in flames. When we look back over the armored vehicles, you think, my God, this is what an armored cavalry troop in the assault can accomplish in that short amount of time.
They called it the Battle of 73 Easting, after the map coordinate. 28 Republican Guard tanks were destroyed. That night, the Americans routed an entire division of the Republican Guard. The other 5 Republican Guard divisions started a desperate retreat. Their best hope of survival came from an unlikely quarter.
Colin Powell and Dick Cheney came over to the White House to give the president their daily report on how the war was going. And by that time, we knew both from the military reports and from satellites about the highway of death leading north out of Kuwait City and the incredible destruction of the Iraqi convoys and so on. We knew all this would eventually be on television. And I remember very clearly Colin Powell saying that this thing was turning into a massacre and that to continue it beyond a certain point would be un-American. And he even used the word unchivalrous.
While the American army battled the Republican Guard, the Iraqi positions around Kuwait lay empty. American Marines gathered outside the city. The question now was whether the Republican Guard could be destroyed before it became politically expedient to stop a war which had already achieved its main purpose: the liberation of Kuwait. Destroyed Iraqi tanks lined the road into Kuwait City. The Marine commander had feared thousands of his troops would die. 28 had, but now the city was his.
We had made arrangements for the Arab coalition forces to go into the city. And I was sitting there getting a little restless and wondering, okay, what are we going to do? I'm tired of sitting here, so we drove into the city. And the outpouring was something I'll never forget. I don't know where all the people came from. They came down to the side of the road by the thousands. And they had Kuwaiti flags, and some had American flags. vehicles that the Iraqis hadn't stolen or destroyed. They had acquired some of those, so they were driving around us in this mad circle. I thought, sure, we were going to crush a vehicle. What they were saying was, God bless you, America, God bless you. You know, we love you. Very, very emotional moment for us after all of this.
Saddam Hussein had expected a bloody stalemate on the battlefield that would undermine the coalition's resolve. Now he was fighting to survive. The Allies wanted to destroy his retreating army, above all its elite Republican Guard divisions, and break Iraq as a military power. His regime was judged unlikely to survive such humiliation.
He sat in front of me and he was almost in tears. Not crying, but almost in tears. He said, "We do not know what God will bring upon us tomorrow." He was virtually collapsing. He had reached the depths.
Kuwait City was free, but the most intense fighting of the war was about to begin. While the British rounded up the army in the south, the American tanks were chasing Iraq's best troops, the Republican Guard. Except for a rear guard, they were retreating, but the Americans were determined to destroy them.
We never once said to anybody, your mission is going to be complete as soon as we kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait. That was not what we told our forces. We said to our forces that we wanted to close with and destroy the Republican Guards.
The Iraqi rear guard prepared for battle. As the Americans advanced, scores of tanks from the Republican Guard's Medina division were dug in along a low ridge. The defensive line stretched for 6 miles. What happened next became known as the Battle of Medina Ridge. The Iraqi tanks only had a range of 1 mile, around half that of the American tanks.
We took prisoners, very few, at Medina Ridge. Very few. I saw 3. And in the desert, you could see for miles. Most people I saw were dead. Later on in the battle, when I rolled up there was pieces everywhere. I have never seen such destruction in my life. I was just shocked that people can do so much devastation in such a short period of time.
In all, 300 Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles, together with their crews, were destroyed along the 6-mile front. 1 American was killed. Nothing stood between the retreating Republican Guard and destruction. A radio message told Saddam Hussein of the defeat.
Saddam thought his downfall was imminent. He asked me, "Do you think the Allies will come as far as Baghdad?" He was quite desperate and frightened.
With the rear guard destroyed, Schwarzkopf sent American tanks driving for the sea. Meanwhile, more tanks and airborne forces raced to close the trap on the Iraqi troops. All afternoon, waves of gunships attacked the Iraqi troops.
We're going to back away from them a little bit. They seem to be no threat at all. Okay, 47.
In the confusion of battle, no one could be sure how many units were retreating undetected. But the American forces intended to cut them off and trap them all in a ring of Allied tanks.
They can do it. This is one of the dragon-looking bunch. This is, shit, I don't know what the hell to do with these guys. Okay, they're leading.
We spent the whole journey on foot, walking among dead bodies. Dead soldiers were everywhere. The army's morale had collapsed.
It doesn't seem like this third war. I just feel sorry for them, you know, and when you throw out food, they all run, and it doesn't seem like they want to fight.
70,000 had surrendered. The Americans no longer bothered to guard them. They just set them to the rear.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
To close the trap on the Iraqis, and particularly the Republican Guard, the fighting had to continue. But in Washington, America's most senior general worried that horrific television pictures of the slaughter would eventually stain the reputation of the U.S. military.
You don't do unnecessary killing if it can be avoided. At some point, you decide you've accomplished your objectives and you stop. We owned Kuwait City. The question was, how much additional destruction do we want to inflict upon the Iraqi army that was in the Kuwait theater?
On the battlefield, Apache gunships designed to destroy tank columns were hunting down individual soldiers. To protect the American military against charges of killing for the sake of killing, Colin Powell was willing to let the surviving Iraqi forces escape. Powell decided to call Norman Schwarzkopf. It was 7 a.m. in Washington, 3 p.m. in the desert.
Colin said to me, "What are your plans?" My response to him was, "We plan to continue to execute the operation and continue to drive towards the sea, east towards the sea." And he then said to me, "How long would that take you?" And my response to him was, it will take until the end of tomorrow. So we could cease fire tomorrow evening at dark, and we would have completely accomplished the plan.
Sitting in the Pentagon, Powell knew this meant another day of killing. The president had to make a decision.
After talking to Schwarzkopf, I went over to the White House. I took the president through the situation on the ground. I pointed out that we were starting to see some scenes that were unpleasant. And we were in the window of calling an end to it so as that there was not unnecessary additional loss of life on the part of American and coalition forces or on the part of Iraqi youngsters.
Colin said, "We basically have done it. We have destroyed the Republican Guard. We have expelled them from Kuwait. We have essentially completed our objectives, and I believe we are just a few hours from completing that effort."
And I would expect that within the next 24 hours, I would be bringing you a recommendation with respect to the cessation of hostilities. The president then said, "Well, if that's the case, if we're within the window, why not end it now?"
And there was a feeling, I think it was especially pronounced on the part of General Powell, that we'd asked the troops to do about all we could do by way of continuing the slaughter. I mean, in fact, the Iraqi resistance was collapsing fairly rapidly. And it was pretty clear that we'd won a tremendous victory.
Colin Powell called me. He said, "I'm at the White House. We've discussed ending the war. Could you, in fact, execute a ceasefire if it was declared effective midnight Washington time tonight?" Which would have been first thing in the morning, our time. I told him that I could live with that.
And he said, "Yeah, I think that's probably the right thing to do," or words to that effect.
Quite frankly, the driving force behind my saying that I could live with it was the fact that if we went on another day, we were going to kill some more of our people, and we had already won an overwhelming victory with a minimum of casualties, and that was good enough for me.